Okay, then. Good afternoon. I'm Roberto Serpieri. Just for the video, I am professor at the Department of Social Sciences in this university, where I teach education policy and sociology of education, where I work with Emiliano Grimaldi in particular and other colleagues, and we usually made a lot of research studies also with Paolo Landri during the years. And I would like to say just a few words about my background. I come from the field of organization studies. And when I started to study school organization, it was about 20 years ago. And during that time, I usually conducted research about the relation between the public administration in Italy, between political leaders and high civil servants. So once a union, professional union, asked me to study the implementation of a reform, of a school reform in Italy, and because of my main point of interest in leadership, in organizational leadership, and especially I am very concerned about the role of power in organization. I met a very important book which author probably don't recognize as its best performance, which was Micropolitics in School by Stephen Ball. And it was a very challenging book at that time because it was about school organization, but with a very contrasting point of view against the mainstreaming research and studies about the organization of schools. And that was the time where I could say that in the public sector as a whole, it was intervening very strongly the variation of policies, the revolution in a certain way of policies, thanks to the neoliberal government of the fields. And the school was invested just during the 80s, as you know, especially in England, in Europe, and mainly in other countries, but with in this kind of trend, Italy appeared very late in a certain time. But anyway, just at the straddle of the two millenniums, also the Italian school reform tried to emulate mainstreaming neoliberal kind of governments of education. So I would like to present these arguments about school leadership, not only because it is my main field of interest, but because I think it is very interesting to know, to look at how the different theories of educational leadership have accompanied during the years this kind of reforms, this kind of neoliberal pressures under different, as you know, political regime of government. And it is also very interesting to note how school leaders have become, in a certain way, the real knot, the real lever of this kind of introduction, this kind of education policy. And they've been requested to to act, to behave, to enact policies in very strong and challenging situation and context. As you know, in some countries it is even difficult to find someone who is prone to become a leader, for example in England, in a special way. I always say to my friends who works in the Italian schools who desire to become a leader, a head teacher in Italy, to go in other countries to appoint, to be appointed as an educational leader, because we in Italy usually we have a national appointment managed by the Ministry of Education, and every 2 or 3, 4 years at least, there are thousands of applications to become head teachers. So it is very strange in this kind of situation to become a leadership. It becomes also it means also to become a sort of privileged roles in terms of career, because in Italy we don't have any other kind of making careers in the education system. So this was the reason I was very concerned about school leadership, and because my background is also in the field of critical studies, I try to use for the most part of my interpretive framework some references to the Foucauldian theories, let's say, approaches, let's say, in the field of education, and especially in the field of governmentality studies. So this afternoon I will present three main, my presentation will be organized around three main parts. The first thing is why to think of a governmentality dispositive instead of thinking of school education systems or apparatuses as ideological apparatuses. This pertains for the most part of the reasons to the same arguments Emiliano developed this morning, but especially I want to focus on how dispositive is a conceptual tool of a course. It's a way of interpreting a sort of assemblage between the production of truth, the production of systems of knowledge interconnected with relations of power or techniques of government. There has been a shift in Foucault's language between these terms. We will focus on later about this relative shift. And the third question about dispositive is the role of us as subjects. And as you know, Foucault has been a philosopher and historian who thought of the human as in terms of the death of the man, especially during his last archaeological period. But in the last time, especially during the 80s, he was very concerned about questions regarding subjectivities in a very specific way, of course. And the second part of the presentation will be about a map about educational theories and paradigms, let's say, just to try to understand how is it possible to conceive of leadership along different conceptions of men, of ontological statuses of men, and other ontological presuppositions. And I will try also to show how this kind of theories, this kind of paradigms are very well connected with, for example, ideological, let's say, between quotes, ideological presupposition of neoliberal paradigms and theory, and of course of educational neoliberal policies. And the third part will focus mainly on critical studies on education leadership, trying to discuss with you sort of a metaphor of interpreting how critical studies about leadership have developed during the last 2 decades, but especially during the last one, identifying a sort of paradoxical approach to educational policy without any special conception about the role of education leaders. So, in a certain way, in the critical studies and research, the leaders tend to disappear. Okay? So, let's start with I will try to manage my relation between glasses, the screen, and the monitor. Well, the first argument is why to introduce dispositive as a main conceptual tool. The main reason is that this kind of dispositive, this kind of conceptual tool connects very well 3 different, let's say, dimensions of education policies, education system, and so also if this kind of arguments, such as policy, systems, institutions, are not very well located in a Foucauldian approach to the education field, let's say. So we will try to combine the proper language from Foucault with other languages coming from, for example, governmental studies, with governmentality studies, which is not exactly the same thing. So what is very important, it is the kind of intersection between governmentality, regimes of truth, and technologies of the self. This language is very connected with the last Foucault's thought, because usually when scholars, researchers, and especially some critical exponent of the Foucauldian approach try to restrict the vision of Foucault about the dyad conceptual dimension of knowledge power as strictly interconnected between the two. Something has been said by Eric this morning, but we will come later to this kind of problem. And it is interesting that in this kind of conceptualization, the dispositive is seen in a very similar way with other postmodernist, let's say, approach, such as, for example, the actor network theory, in terms of assemblages of different kind of materials, of human actors, text, and so on. And in fact, we could say that there is a strong connection, for example, of actor-nectar theory with the conception, the readings of Foucault's ideas of dispositive proposed by Deleuze. And very recently, Judith Revel, which is a very clever scholar of Foucault, has proposed this kind of imaging as a contextual and mobile configuration. And at the end of the presentation, I will show you how the idea of leadership configuration will be very central in some approaches in terms of critical studies to education leadership. So, in this perspective, of course, this kind of conceptual tool, it is really distinguished from the traditional Marxist idea of school system as school system, religious systems, educational systems, and so far, in terms of ideological apparatuses, in terms of a special role proposed by organization well evident, very visible, where whose boundaries are very well identified. In this perspective, I think that there are three main implications. The one is the abandonment of a conspiracy theory. When we spoke, for example, of neoliberal paradigms, neoliberal policies, neoliberal, let's say also methodological and technologies of government, many times we are in a certain way thinking of something that implies a sort of a false conscience for other people. So they are trying to propose this kind of, for example, educational policy recipes in terms of producing a sort of compliance, of hidden compliance toward this kind of policies. The second thing is the fact that adopting a sort of distance toward ideology, it is possible to focus especially on transparencies. So if we deny the distinction which is between the hidden and the visible, and we try to have a look, as has been said by Foucault himself, at the surface of the discourse, what could be very interesting, and I think that many things have been said during these days, but of course, especially by Emiliano this morning, sometimes transparency is something to be explored in a very particular way. So, in terms of sociological concepts, we could say that sometimes it's very important to try to discover, to explore which is under what is taken for granted. And the third idea is that many times ideology or the cultural, let's say, is something which is behind other more important level dimension of the social, of the economics, which are more determinants in terms of the production of policies, for example. So Foucault was very cautious about the idea of using ideology. So I think that we could try to list this kind of questions. How do discursive formations arise to fabricate the reality of leadership, the visibility of leadership? What are the epistemic premises, the regimes of truth that define leadership? Which kind of subjectivation encapsulates a teacher's through technologies of governmentality? What freedom can be practiced? There is a space for ethical choices, and what alternative truths are in play to resist against the neoliberal education policies. I would like to highlight especially the idea that from a Foucauldian perspective of point of view, the emphasis should be placed more on practices than institutions. So we should try to look at the practices instead of the institutions, and this is coherent with the anti-juridical position of Foucault, with the idea that too many times the lectures of a reality is confined in a sort of juridical field, especially when we study educational policy, for example, when we think of government in terms of institution, when we think of school in terms of organization, when we think of leaders in terms of proper role, and so on. But we will come back later on this. And so in this kind of view, power cannot be divided between a repression function and an ideological function, because coherently with the idea that knowledge and power work together, this kind of distinction couldn't have any sense. And another thing which is very important to me to clarify is the idea that refusing an institutionalist approach, also the idea of the state, of course, is forced to be conceived in another manner. So in this kind, the idea of governmentality tends to look at the emergencies of the processes of government. Government is something which is not very possible even to rationalize in a very proper way, apart from juridical approaches, of course. And in this sense, the state is nothing else than a mobile effect of a regime of multiple governmentalities. About the terms governmentality, should be said that in especially Anglophone governmentality scholars, the idea of governmentality has recalled the conception of a way of governing mentalities, no? Governmentalities, which is very coherent in a certain way with the ideas of the conductor, the way with every one of us is, let's say, forced to conduct in a certain way, but it also leads herself to conduct in a certain way. So in this proper manner, in the idea of Foucault, governmentality is simple, a new terms he invented just to find a new suffix to the idea of government. But anyway, the metaphor of governmentalities is also very powerful. In the idea of the depicting of the relation between power and knowledge, Foucault has went to another idea, trying to stress also what could be called a complex, a whole regime of truth, and trying to couple a set of practices which could be researched, discussed about, with a strong connection with the relationship between people, within artifacts, within text, trying to clearly locate the division between the true and the false. But in this case, the false doesn't have the meaning of ideological. It means that the true is what is true is what can be conceived, what can be said from people, what can be practiced, but without any hidden conception of the truth, of the real truth. We divide our conception within what is true and what is false, and we truly believe that the false is false, without any presumption about something which is hidden. And the other thing very important, as I told you before, is the connection with the idea of subjectivation. Here, during the last periods of his life, and during especially after the second half of the 70s, Foucault stressed how he was always implicating roles for subjects, but renouncing the idea of a subject as a monadic entity, as an ontological statue, let's say, but trying to stress how, thanks to the relation between government and truth, we are constituting ourselves in two different ways. One is the way when, for example, as for madness, as for illness, when professional knowledge, expertise knowledge invent categories. So this is the special case, how educational leadership has been invented during the last decades in a certain way, because as we know, before educational leadership there was a lot of discussion of studying the role of a school administrator, for example, or of a professional leader, but not of educational leadership. And educational leadership appeared almost at the same time when an idea of school management was also conceived during, thanks to the neoliberal policies. And there is also another very interesting thing to notice. The idea of a subject, in this case, renouncing to the idea of a sole role of a subject, of the human, but conceiving of our identities as a plurality, as a way to constitute different kind of subjectivities. We are not always the same. There is a very famous interview from Foucault when he thinking of the possibility that we could practice at the same time compliance to our pressures from outside of them, let's say outside of them, and pressure that we impose to ourselves, and other spaces of freedom that we could explore at the same time. And in this famous interview, he said, we don't behave necessarily at the same time with the same attitudes, for example, participating to a political meeting or to sexual relations, and so on. And I think this is very interesting to notice, because it opens up spaces of resistance for us as subjects in this kind of conceptions. So I think this is very important to notice that everyone could establish a different type of relation to oneself depending on different contexts, on different situations, on different implication in this kind of regimes of truth and governmental technologies.